It was raining hard enough that night to blur the edges of everything. The streetlights outside my workshop bled into the dark, and even the old radio I kept on for company had given up trying to sound cheerful. I was upstairs, sanding a cabinet door, telling myself, like I often did, that this was enough. Work. Quiet. Predictability. Then my phone buzzed on the workbench. I didn't recognize the number at first. When the name appeared, my hand froze. Sarah Delaney. I hadn't seen her in years. Before I could decide whether to answer, the phone buzzed again. When I finally picked up, she didn't say hello. Her voice came through thin and controlled, almost swallowed by the rain. "He won't open the door," she whispered. "I'm on the porch. Can you come get me?" Moments like that don't feel dramatic when they arrive. They feel inconvenient, interruptive, like something you could reasonably step away from if you wanted to. I was 42, divorced, living above a woodworking shop in a small Pennsylvania town, and I had built my life very carefully after my marriage ended. I worked with my hands. I kept to myself. I convinced myself that fixing broken furniture was close enough to fixing a broken life. Sarah wasn't a stranger. We'd crossed paths years back, community events, school fundraisers, the kind of shared history small towns collect. I knew she was married. I knew she worked nearby. That was the extent of it. And now she was whispering like someone afraid her voice might change the outcome if it got too loud. I want to be honest with you. I didn't immediately feel brave. My first thought wasn't about helping. It was about consequences, about gossip, about my business. In towns like ours, stories don't wait for facts. They just find a shape and move. I could have told her to call the police. I could have said this wasn't my place. I could have protected the quiet life I'd built and gone back to sanding that cabinet door. As I grabbed my keys, I remember thinking how easy it would have been to stay, to let the call sit unanswered a little longer, to tell myself this wasn't my responsibility, and how permanent that kind of decision always turns out to be. So I said the only thing that made sense once I heard it leave my mouth. "Don't go anywhere. I'm on my way." The drive felt longer than it was. Rain hammered the windshield. The roads were empty, like the town itself was holding its breath. When I pulled up, I saw her standing under the porch overhang, soaked at the edges, a small travel bag at her feet. She didn't look dramatic. She looked tired. Behind the glass door, I could see movement, a shadow passing, stopping, choosing not to open. No shouting. No scene. Just a quiet decision being enforced. She looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to apologize or run. I told her to get in the truck. We didn't talk on the drive back. Some situations don't improve with commentary. At my place, the shop below was dark, the apartment upstairs unfamiliar to her. I showed her the guest room and told her she could stay there. That I had won. That it was no trouble. Those words sound casual, but they weren't. Saying them meant stepping out of a life I designed to be manageable. It meant accepting uncertainty instead of silence. After she closed the door to the guest room, I sat alone at the kitchen table and listened to the rain slow down. I thought about how many years I'd spent repairing other people's things while convincing myself my own life didn't need fixing. I wondered what it costs a man to stay quiet when someone asks for help, and what it costs when he doesn't. I didn't know what would happen next. I only knew that for the first time in a long while, I hadn't chosen the safest option. And that choice had already shifted something, whether I was ready for it or not. I forgot she was there. That's how the morning began. I came down the stairs above the shop, already thinking about a warped cabinet frame that needed fixing, when I heard a sound that didn't belong to my routine. A cup being set down too carefully. A drawer opening, then stopping halfway, like someone wasn't sure they were allowed to finish what they started. I froze on the last step, listening. Then it came back to me. Sarah was in my house. She stood in the kitchen, wearing one of my old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled too far up, holding a mug with both hands. She looked uncomfortable, not scared. That distinction mattered. She apologized immediately for the coffee, for the noise, for being there at all. People who feel like a burden apologize before they're accused of anything. I told her it was fine. And it was. But as I poured myself coffee and leaned against the counter, I became aware of something that unsettled me more than the situation itself. How quickly a single unexpected person could change the shape of a life I thought was settled. For years after my divorce, I trained myself not to notice the extra chair, the second mug, the silence in the evenings. That morning, all of it came rushing back. For a brief moment, I hated myself for how good it felt not to be alone. That scared me more than her story ever could. We ate a simple breakfast. Nothing special. Eggs. Toast. The radio low enough to feel like company without demanding attention. After a while, she began to talk, not like someone unloading a confession, but like someone laying out facts they'd already rehearsed alone. She told me about her first marriage and how she swore she wouldn't repeat that mistake. About how the second time, she wanted what people call a normal American life. Stability. A house that looked right from the street. Someone dependable. At first, she said, it felt calm. Then the questions started. Who she talked to at work. Why she stayed late. Why her phone was face down. None of it loud. None of it dramatic. Just constant. Like water wearing down stone. When arguments happened, he didn't shout. He shut her out. Locked the door. Left her on the porch like a lesson meant to be learned quietly. She told me the hardest part wasn't fear. It was embarrassment. In a small town, being divorced once already felt like something you carried around with you. Being on the edge of another failure at 48 felt like proof. She said she'd convinced herself she deserved it for choosing wrong again. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. I told her how my own marriage ended, not with betrayal, but with delay. Too many conversations postponed. Too many evenings choosing work over honesty. I said out loud something I hadn't admitted in years, that I lost my marriage one will talk later at a time, until later never came. There was relief in saying that. Not absolution, just recognition. Later, when she rested upstairs and I went back down to the shop, the weight of the situation finally settled in. A married woman was staying in my house, above my business, in my town. I imagined the looks at the diner. The quiet recalculations people make when they think no one's watching. My livelihood depended on trust, and trust in small communities is fragile. Here was the choice no one talks about. I could set boundaries immediately, give her a timeline, push her toward a decision that restored my sense of control. Or I could accept that sometimes doing the decent thing means living longer in uncertainty than you plan to. That evening, as I straightened the guest room again, I noticed she still hadn't unpacked. Her bag remained zipped. Shoes lined up neatly by the wall, ready to leave. She fell asleep, like someone trained not to settle too deeply anywhere. Seeing that, I realized something uncomfortable about myself. A part of me wanted her to stay, not just because it was right, but because it eased something in me I'd ignored for years. That thought forced another choice. I could pretend my motives were pure and uncomplicated. Or I could acknowledge that doing the right thing doesn't mean you're free of selfish reasons. It means you don't let them decide for you. I went downstairs and turned off the shop lights, sitting alone among my tools in the quiet. I didn't know how long this situation would last. I only knew that whatever came next would test more than my patience. It would test whether I could live honestly with myself while someone else figured out how to live again. The first thing that told me something was wrong wasn't a confrontation. It was a voicemail. A regular customer, someone I'd worked for years, called to say he needed to pause the project for a bit. No explanation. No complaint. Just that careful tone people use when they don't want to say what they've already heard. I replayed it twice in my shop, listening to the hum of the machines die down, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. In a small town, you don't lose work loudly. You lose it politely. Upstairs, Sarah kept herself busy the way people do when they don't want to feel like they're taking up space. She organized my invoices, straightened paperwork I'd ignored, offered help without ever asking for permission to stay. I told myself the situation was temporary, manageable. But temporary is a word men use when they want to believe they're still in control. That afternoon, I heard tires on gravel outside the shop. Not the quick roll of a delivery van. This was slower, heavier, a pickup that wanted to be noticed. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped into the doorway. The man who got out looked exactly like I expected. Clean jacket, steady movements, not angry, not rushed. The kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from certainty. He looked past me, toward the apartment over the shop, like he already knew what he'd find. So this is where the service is now, he said. Pick up a man's wife and bring her home like you're running a shelter. His voice stayed level. That's what made it dangerous. Real pressure rarely raises its voice. I felt the first pull toward the easiest lie. Tell him she wasn't here. Tell him he was mistaken. Close the door and let the problem find someone else. That was the fork in the road. One path protected my business, my name, my quiet life. The other put all of it at risk. I thought about the voicemail, about how quickly things were already shifting without a word being spoken. She's here, I said, because she didn't feel safe at home. He smiled like I'd said something naive. Safe, he repeated. That's the story now. This isn't a story, I told him. If you have an issue, you can take it up through an attorney. Or the police. Not like this. His smile tightened. Big words for a guy who builds shelves. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if he were doing me a favor. You know how this works, Jake. People don't wait for facts. They decide what makes sense to them. And they remember. I could already picture it. The looks at the diner, the unreturned calls, the quiet recalculation of my worth. I wanted to tell him to leave. I wanted to raise my voice. But anger would only give him a shape he could use. There's nothing for us to argue about, I said. She's an adult. She decides where she stays. That's when his tone changed. Not louder, sharper. And what do you think they'll decide about her? He asked. 48. Second marriage. Ends up at a divorced man's place overnight? People will make that fit whatever version they need. That landed harder than anything else. Not because it was true, but because it was the fear she'd been living with long before I answered the phone. He got back into his truck without another word and drove off slowly, gravel popping under the tires like punctuation. When I turned back inside, Sarah was halfway down the stairs. She hadn't heard everything. She'd heard enough. He was here, she said. I nodded. What did he say? Here was my next choice. I could soften it, protect her from the sharp edges. Or I could tell her the truth and risk sending her back into shame. He thinks he can scare us with what people might say, I said. Her shoulders dropped, just a little. They will, she whispered. They'll say I'm the problem, that I did this. I wanted to promise her it wouldn't matter. But I've lived long enough to know promises like that don't age well. Then we don't give them anything extra, I said. We keep this clean. No secrets. You make your decisions. I don't speak for you. That night, another message came in. A second client postponing. No accusation. Just distance. Sitting alone in the darkened shop, I finally admitted the part one hadn't wanted to face. Answering her call hadn't just brought risk into my life. It had already started changing it. The question wasn't whether this would cost me something. The question was whether I could live with myself if I pretended I didn't know why. I noticed the silence before I noticed anything else. No footsteps overhead. No kettle clicking on. No careful drawer sliding shut. Just the steady ticking of the wall clock in my shop, louder than it had any right to be. I stood there with my jacket still on, keys in my hand. And for a second, I let myself believe she'd only stepped out for air. That it was nothing. Then I climbed the stairs and saw the guest room door open, and the quiet turned into something heavier. The room looked wrong. Too neat. The blanket folded tighter than she'd left it. The dresser drawer half empty. Her bag gone. On the pillow sat a small piece of paper, folded once, placed carefully like she didn't want to wake anyone with it. I didn't snatch it up right away. Some truths don't get easier just because you reach them faster. The note was short. Thank you for everything. I need to sort this out on my own. No blame. No argument. Just distance written politely. like she was checking out of a hotel instead of stepping back into a life that had already cornered her. I sat on the edge of the bed longer than I care to admit, not because I felt betrayed, but because I understood what her words meant. She wasn't choosing him. She was choosing space. And sometimes that choice hits harder because you can't fight it. You can't reason with it. You can only respect it or refuse to. And here's the part I'm not proud of, but I'm going to tell you anyway. For a brief moment, I almost felt relieved. That scared me. Relief meant I could go back to the life I'd built after my divorce, the life where nothing asked anything of me. No risk. No gossip. No late-night choices. Just wood, tools, records, and quiet. Relief meant I could stop bracing for footsteps and phone calls and consequences. Then the second wave came, the one that followed the relief like a shadow. The understanding that if I let myself settle into that comfort, I'd be doing what I always did, closing the door on anything that might change me, calling it peace when it was really just avoidance. The day moved in broken pieces. I drove to a client's house for measurements, nodded when he spoke, smiled when I needed to, and felt like I was watching myself from a few feet away. I kept thinking about that porch, about her voice in the rain, about how quickly my shop had started to feel exposed once her husband showed up, about the voicemail from the customer who'd paused a project. In a small town, your name is a fragile thing. You spend years building it, and one rumor can put a crack in it you never fully sand out. Here was my internal choice, whether I wanted it or not. I could accept her note and shut this chapter gently, telling myself I'd done enough. Or I could reach for an explanation, not to pull her back, but to keep the story from turning into another unfinished repair inside my own head. I didn't call her. Not right away. That wasn't pride. It was respect. Sometimes the quickest move is the wrong one. I told myself, if she wants distance, let her have it. Let her breathe. Let her make a decision without my shadow leaning over it. Late afternoon, I drove through town to pick up supplies I didn't even truly need. And as I passed the courthouse square, I saw her. It was so ordinary, I almost missed it. A small law office I'd passed 100 times without noticing. The door opened, and Sarah stepped out with a folder pressed against her chest. Not like a shield, like proof. Her shoulders looked tired, but her walk was steady, focused. She didn't glance around like someone hiding. She didn't look hunted. She looked like a woman doing something difficult because it needed doing. She didn't see me. I didn't honk. I didn't wave her down. I just slowed enough to understand what I was looking at. She hadn't gone back. She hadn't run. She'd gone to learn her options, to put her own name on the next steps, instead of letting the town write a version of her story that fit their appetite. That realization shifted something in me. Relief, yes, but a different kind. The kind that comes when you realize a person isn't asking you to carry them. They're asking you not to turn away while they learn how to carry themselves. She came back that evening, quietly. No suitcase. Just her coat damp at the edges from the cold air. Her hair still holding a little of the outside. She hesitated at my door like she wasn't sure she was allowed to re-enter. I opened it wider, stepped aside, and let her decide to cross the threshold on her own. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, like apology was still her reflex. "I shouldn't have left like that." "You don't owe me an explanation," I told her. She shook her head. "I do. I didn't want you to be the headline. I didn't want anyone saying you rescued me, or that I'm here because of you. I needed to go alone, just once. That, more than anything, earned my respect, because it told me she wasn't looking for a replacement life. She was trying to build her own. We sat on the shop floor that night, between unfinished boards and the smell of varnish and old wood. No music, no speeches, just two adults speaking carefully, the way you do when words start to matter again. She admitted her biggest fear wasn't being alone. It was being remembered as the woman who failed twice and proved everyone right. The woman people could point at and say, "See, that's what happens." I told her mine, that I'd spent years fixing other people's things because it was easier than fixing my own. That part of me wanted her to stay not only because it was right, but because it made my evenings feel less empty. Saying it out loud didn't make me look noble. It made me look human. And at this point in my life, I'd rather be human than impressive. We agreed on something simple and hard. She would keep moving forward on her terms. I would be present, not as a savior, not as a solution, but as support. No deadlines. No pressure. No pretending this was easy. When she went upstairs, she unpacked only what she needed, slowly, like she was teaching herself it was safe to take up space. I stayed in the shop a while longer, lights low, listening to the building settle. I'd mistaken silence for resolution before. I'd called distance fine, because it didn't demand anything from me. This time, the silence felt different. It felt like the pause before a real decision. And I knew deep down, the next step wouldn't be about whether she stayed under my roof. It would be about whether I could keep choosing the harder kind of decency, without expecting it to reward me. The envelope sat on my kitchen table longer than it needed to. White. Plain. Official in the way only paperwork can be. Sarah had left it there early that morning before heading out, saying she wanted to walk and think. I didn't touch it. Not because it wasn't my business, but because I'd learned something over the past few months. Timing matters. Some things lose their meaning if you rush them. When she came back, she stood on the porch for a moment before coming in, breathing slowly, like someone steadying themselves before cold water. I watched her through the window and thought about how different she looked from the night I picked her up in the rain. Not happier, not lighter, more grounded, as if something inside her had finally stopped leaning. She held up the envelope when she stepped inside. It started, she said. No drama. No relief. Just fact. Divorce papers filed. The process officially moving forward. I nodded, feeling the weight of it settle between us like an object neither of us wanted to drop. We sat at the table with coffee growing cold. This was the moment where a younger version of me would have tried to fix things by offering certainty. A plan. A future. Something neat enough to cover the fear underneath. I felt that instinct rise up again, familiar and tempting. Ask her to stay. Tell her we could make this easier. That she didn't need another move. That my place could be the answer to everything she'd just been through. Here was my final choice. The most important one. I could speak from fear and pull her closer than she was ready for. Or I could speak from respect and risk losing her altogether. So instead, I asked her the question I'd been avoiding. How do you see your life now? I said, not as someone's wife, but as yourself. She didn't answer right away. She looked around the kitchen like she was taking inventory of what belonged to her and what didn't. Then she said something that hurt in a quiet, honest way. She said she wasn't ready to move straight from one dependence to another. That she needed to know she could stand on her own, pay her own bills, sit alone at night without feeling punished for it. She wanted a small apartment nearby. Not a new town. Not a clean break. Just space that was hers. I won't pretend that didn't sting. Part of me wanted to argue that independence didn't mean isolation. Another part knew that if I pushed now, I'd be repeating mistakes I'd already paid for once. So I told her the truth. That I was afraid of losing her. That I'd grown used to hearing someone upstairs, to sharing quiet evenings. But that I didn't want to be the reason she skipped a step she needed to take for herself. Saying that out loud didn't make me brave. It made me honest. We didn't make promises the way people do in movies. We made smaller ones. She found a modest apartment a few blocks away. Close enough to walk, far enough to feel separate. We agreed to see each other without forcing definitions. Coffee at the diner. Walks around the neighborhood. Helping with paperwork when needed. And we agreed on something else, too. The right to say this is hard without turning it into a fight. Time passed the way it usually does, unevenly. Some weeks felt settled. Others didn't. The town adjusted slowly. My business dipped, then steadied again. People looked, then stopped looking. Sarah built a life piece by piece. Not impressive. Not dramatic. Real. One evening, a few months later, I went to her place. It was small, but it felt intentional. Furniture she'd chosen herself. Photos on the wall that had nothing to do with marriages or apologies. A notebook lay open on the table, plans written in the margins. She was on the phone with a friend, laughing, not carefully, not quietly. She didn't notice me right away. Standing there, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel like I'd lost anything by not holding on tighter. I felt like I'd finally learned when to stay present and when to step back. Stories like this usually end with rescue or regret. This one didn't. I didn't save her. I didn't win her. I showed up on a rainy night when she whispered, "He won't open the door." I said, "Then stay with me." And later, I let her walk the distance she needed without turning away. I don't know where we'll be in a year. Life rarely gives you that kind of clarity. But I do know this. I no longer confuse silence with peace. And, at 42, that turned out to be enough. Enough to stop living only for work. Enough to choose presence over comfort. Enough to feel, finally, like my life was something I was part of, not just something I kept repairing from the edges.